वेस्टलैंड के इस श्रृंखला में जो तकरीबन हर महीने होती है और पिछले 2 साल से हम यह श्रृंखला चला रहे हैं, जो किसी किताब के बहाने और किसी विषय के बहाने लेखकों के बीच होती है। 2 भाषाओं में कम से कम, हिंदी और अंग्रेज़ी, ये चर्चा होती है। और इस बार हमारे लिए खुशी की बात यह है कि हमारी पुरानी दोस्त कल्पना करुणाकरण की किताब पर हम बात करने वाले हैं, अ वुमन ऑफ नो कॉन्सिक्वेंस। इस किताब के शीर्षक से आपको लग सकता है कि ये क्या शीर्षक हुआ। जिस औरत का कोई मसरफ़ नहीं, आप उस पर बात करने जा रहे हैं, लेकिन उसके बहाने एक पूरा इतिहास, एक समय का, ख़ासकर तमिलनाडु का, वह इतिहास यह किताब आपके सामने लाती है। कल्पना IIT मद्रास में समाज विज्ञान विभाग में पढ़ाती हैं। उनकी विशेष रुचि जेंडर, गरीबी और माइक्रो फाइनेंस के बीच के रिश्तों पर है और उस पर वे काम करती रही हैं। वे अनुवाद भी करती हैं। मैं उनका बहुत लंबा परिचय नहीं दे रहा हूँ। सबसे पहले एक रस्म, इस किताब को आपके सामने जारी करने की रस्म, मैं आपसे अनुरोध करूँगा कि आप उसे पूरा करें। कल्पना प्लीज़, वी हैव टू अनटाई दिस। और आपको ताली बजानी है। इस चर्चा का तरीका पुराना है, आप क्लासिकल तरीका कह सकते हैं, जिसमें हम सबसे पहले कल्पना से, विल रिक्वेस्ट कल्पना टू फर्स्ट टॉक अबाउट हर बुक फॉर 12 to 15 minutes, and then a very neat arrangement. Revatilal and Geeta both speak on the book, and then they have a conversation. So Kalpana, please come.
So my dear friends, I want to begin by thanking you all very, very much for coming here. In the audience, I see some of my former students from IIT Madras. I see my old dear friends from JNU. I see old comrades and friends of my mother whom I stole and made my friends. And of course, I also see new faces, which is always a good thing, which is always a great thing. And I hope this evening is worth your time and your effort. So, yes, right at the outset, I need to say that this book is on the life of my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, Pankajam. And I want to just start this brief introduction to the book with some preliminary questions, which is, why and when does a woman choose to tell a story of a female ancestor, a grandmother in this case, thus shining a light on family history, not all of which may bear the light of public scrutiny? And how does the writer approach her subject in a manner that reflects her conviction that the personal is always political? And how does she write a biography that retains the distinctive singularity of an exceptional woman while situating her in an all too familiar, unexceptional social universe? So, while I begin with these questions, in order to propose some introduction to how I dealt with these questions, I have to turn to my mother, Maithili. Now, I have to briefly, therefore, tell you who she was. While some of you may, of course, know her, Maithili Sivaraman was a full-time party worker, political worker with the CPIM, a trade unionist, a women's movement organizer, a feminist, a writer who wrote about social movements from the front lines of those movements, and who worked amongst agricultural laborers and industrial factory workers. Maithili was active in class politics of Tamil Nadu for close to 4 decades of her life, taking on both caste oppression and patriarchy. And just to set this in context, can I please ask you to change the... Oh, you have, yes. Here's a title of the cover page of a book by Maithili, for those of you who may not have read this book. These are essays by Maithili. And this is that was published by Leftward in 2013, Haunted by Fire, referring to the infamous massacre of Kirvanmani in Tanjavur district of Tamil Nadu in December 1968. Essays on caste, class, exploitation and emancipation. Second one, this is again Maithili during the emergency period, with that sometime between 75 and 77, speaking in Madurai at a street corner protest. That was probably Chennai. This is again in Madurai in the early 2000s. And finally, Maithili again, you can just keep it here. So, like I said, I have to turn to her first to answer my questions. But why do I have to turn to her? Why do I have to invoke Maithili at all here? Because in addition to doing all this and being all this, Maithili stole time from her public life and her commitments to write a book on her maternal grandmother, Subbalakshmi. Now, who was this Subbalakshmi? She was born in 1897 in a traditional Orthodox Tamil Brahmin household. Subbalakshmi was an unknown woman. She was married at the age of 11 and mother at the age of 14. She was a wife, a mother and a grandmother all her life. And this story was perhaps not unusual at all for a woman of her times. But the thing about Subbalakshmi was that she didn't want to be a wife, a mother or a grandmother. Subbalakshmi longed to throw herself into a world of action, into the anti-colonial nationalist movement that was raging in the streets of Madras in the 1920s. That was a non-cooperation movement, but she was not allowed to. Subbalakshmi had never been to school, but was a voracious reader who picked up the books that her school and college-going older brother would bring home from school and college. So what motivated Maithili, my mother, to write about her grandmother? What was the trigger? As a well-known public figure in Tamil Nadu, Maithili was once asked by a popular Tamil daily, I think this was Ananda Vigadan or Kumudam, to name somebody who had inspired her, right? And to Maithili's surprise, she found herself saying, my grandmother Subbalakshmi. And the answer, as I said, surprised Maithili the most. And Maithili writes in the preface to her book, her name leaped out of my mouth without any conscious search for an icon. By then, of course, Subbalakshmi was long dead. And when Maithili was a child growing up, her grandmother was considered an eccentric, even a mad woman. Maithili grew up witnessing firsthand her grandmother's asthma bouts, her fainting spells, her epileptic seizures. Therefore, then, the question that haunted Maithili was, who was this enigmatic figure, this grandmother whom she did not take the time or the trouble to know when she was alive? So Maithili wrote her book as a way of coming to terms with a deeply unhappy, highly intelligent grandmother, a fascinatingly unconventional woman who found no joy or comfort in family or domestic life, in marriage and not even in motherhood. And so in her book, Maithili asks, so what is insanity? Subbalakshmi was considered mad, wasn't she? So what is insanity? What constitutes the normal? And how are these linked to caste patriarchy and social oppression? Can I show you the next slide? That's the cover page of Maithili's book, Fragments of a Life, a Family Archive, that was published by Zuban in 2006. Subbalakshmi in the cover page is about 14 years old or 13 and a half. She's pregnant with her first child. That's her husband, who is about 25 years old. So I must say, and this slide can remain, when Maithili chose to carve out time consciously and to step back a little bit from her public life to write this book and to do research for this book, it was because she saw this project as no less political than anything else she was doing in her life or she had done. And she felt it was important enough to justify setting aside some of her organizing work, or as her daughter, I can tell you, she would not have done it otherwise. She believed that every minute of a life well spent must be devoted to fighting the good fight. So my book then is about Subbalakshmi's daughter, her daughter, the baby that was in her belly when this picture was taken, her only child who survived to adulthood. Obviously, Maithili's mother. And why did I write this book? Not because it is the fate of women in my family to write about our grandmothers. I wrote this book entirely by accident. In fact, I was trying to gather material to write a book about Maithili in my house. I had written articles about Maithili. I had written a memoir in Tamil about her, a personal memoir as growing up her daughter. And I felt I must get started on writing a proper political biography of Maithili. So I was looking for material in my house when I stumbled upon a small wooden box of my grandmother, Pankajam, on which she had written my writings for Kalpana. Now, Pankajam was born in 1911 when her mother was 14 and died in 2007. She had about 6 years of school life before she was pulled out of school to be married at the age of 17. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so this is the wooden box. That's her handwriting. Yeah, that's where I found many of her writings. Next one. That's Pankajam, 1916, the first picture. Second would have been the early to mid 1930s. And the last was about 87, 88. This can stay, yeah. So, what did I find in the box? In the box, I discovered her autobiography that she had begun writing in 1949 when she was about 38 years old and had continued till 1995 when she was 84 years old, about 1 year after her stroke. All of it was written in English in bits and pieces in the different notebooks, school essay notebooks of her children and her grandchildren. So it was written over 5 decades. Now, apart from her autobiographical writing in which she makes it very clear that she is writing about her life, it's her story, it's a first person account, she also presents her life in fictionalized form. So in the box, I discovered 4 stories, 2 in English, 2 in Tamil. These are stories about women called Meena, Kamala and Lakshmi. They were all, of course, Pankajam. And what was difficult or painful for Pankajam to write about in the first person, she was able to express is the story of Kamala or the story of Meena through this distancing strategy. So essentially, this was autofiction of fictionalized autobiographies. I also, in the same box, found a long essay Pankajam had written about the social life in the city of Madras in the 1930s and the 40s, as she had known it, and a book of her poetry. In addition to all this, in my mother Maithili's collection, I found the letters Pankajam had written her daughter when Maithili was living and working in the US from 1963 to 68. And on average, Pankajam wrote her about 3 letters a month, I think. So that was clearly a rich archive, and thankfully my mother never threw away a scrap of paper in her life. In my book, I use these diverse sources to reconstruct the story of a girl child, Pankajam, growing up in the second decade of the 20th century amidst salt pans in remote seaside villages in the Coromandel coast of Madras Presidency. So this is really the geography that will appear in various forms in the book. Pankajam's autobiography allows me in this book to write about girlhood, its joys and heartbreaks in the 1910s and 1920s, and of school life, of what a classroom in the Lady Willingdon School of Madras looked like in the 1920s, and of the cruel, abrupt end of school life for young girls when they were withdrawn to be married. Her autofiction, the stories of Kamala, Meena and Lakshmi, allowed me to reconstruct an adolescent's dreams of romance and a young woman's yearning for companionship and sexual fulfillment in the 1930s, and of what comes after, a troubled marriage and the story of a young mother raising 5 teenage children coming of age in the early years of post-independence India. Her letters and diaries trace a housewife's quest for intellectual growth and her stubborn efforts to keep alive a life of the mind, a kingdom of the mind, as she writes, or a manorajyam in Tamil. So finally, I'm going to end this by asking, who was Pankajam? Could you go to the next slide? Yeah. In her own words, she was a wife, a mother of 5 children, a housewife who cared for her ailing parents for decades, who managed cows in the shed and a large household. All this tied my nose to everyday mundane things. She has a foreword to her own autobiography that she writes in 1949, in which she asks, "How dare I write about my life? What have I achieved or accomplished?" Can be, yeah. In her foreword, this is, and she writes, "I am not a poet, a writer, a great social worker, or even a society lady. I am not a woman of our time of national struggle," 1949. She was, in her own words, a woman of no consequence at all. In Tamil, when she writes, she calls herself ஒரு சர்வ சாதாரண குடும்ப பெண்மணி. This is just a glimpse of her writing. Again from the foreword, "Housework always keeps the soul fettered down. But why then I should write this is to show how my soul has ever been trying to soar up and break the bondage of the flesh." So when I found the box and read her writings, I knew my job was cut out for me. I had to write about the utterly ordinary life of a woman of no consequence at all, and that proved to be, as I show you, or as I hope to show you in my book if you read it, far from ordinary. And this is how I find myself walking the path my mother did 2 decades ago, writing a book about her grandmother, dreaming of her, and thinking about her. Thank you.
So, Kalpana, of course, could have been more personal, and she hasn't. So, let me serve as a foil to her academic self and begin on a personal note. I actually, except for Subbalakshmi, about whom I heard at great length from Maithili when she was writing the book, we had long discussions, she and I, and also she and Uma Chakravarti, on how she would write about her grandmother. And so, and I knew Pankajam pretty much in the background. Maithili, it's important for all of us women to say that Maithili, who was a spectacular woman at every level, as a friend, as a mentor, as an activist, could only do all that because her mother Pankajam took care of this one. So every time I went to Maithili's, Pankajam would be in the background, and Kalpana, very much like most children, liked to cover her mother's mouth and say, "Pesade, don't speak." So this is very important to say, because this family archive shows you that with not just their own aspirations and dreams and struggles, you have to see both sides of the picture. The oppression they suffered from the closest circle, which was the nuclear and extended family, which was sort of the guardian of patriarchy. Class-wise, they were at an advantage, not so much as the men. The middle-class male Brahmin did much better, got wonderful jobs from the colonials and so forth. Whereas the women, though they were middle class and did not have to suffer poverty, or if you want to call it suffer working outside the house, though that would have probably given them a better life, come to think of it, but they had to be completely circumscribed by the almost insurmountable rules of Brahmin orthodoxy. So it meant that their struggles to read and to write, you have to see that in that context. So I want to think of certain personal scenes. Maithili telling me about Subbalakshmi, wearing a 9-yard sari, little Brahmin woman, standing with a black flag on Mount Road when the Prince of Wales came to Madras. So for this woman who leaves her records not as autobiography, not as action in society as Maithili does, but a kind of code. So Maithili found 21 pages of a diary. But I must say, what really shocked Maithili when she opened that tin trunk was the first edition of Edgar Snow's The Red Star Over China. And Maithili couldn't tell me this without weeping, because this is what happens. We go out into the world and we don't know the silent, the quiet histories lying at home. So while we all learned this phrase, the personal is political, what does that really mean? And Maithili, who was one of the most honest people I knew, would ask herself this. So there was Subbulakshmi. You have certain scenes that come to mind, not only the black flag waving protester, but in code saying, sent 10 rupees to the Congress fund. The husbands were all notoriously stingy. If you read these books, one impression you get of the Brahmin male householder is that do not give money to your wife. Be very cold to your wife, but get along with your grown-up daughters. So nothing is black and white. So the daughters have nice memories of their fathers, which is very strange. But what... another image of Subbulakshmi, which is that she comes home wet with the water cannon. And I think there was even a suggestion that it might have been sewage water. This is Maithili's memories of her. But she's also somebody who goes to an art exhibition with her child, and the Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and Harindranath Chattopadhyay are there, and she makes friends with them. So the desire to occupy a larger space through reading and writing, through some kind of modest involvement in a larger world, and friendship and art. And apparently Subbulakshmi's idea was that Rabindranath was the most handsome man on earth. I hope all the Bengalis in the audience will nod. So she wanted to go to Shantiniketan, but her real desire was that she should go to Shantiniketan and surround herself with art and all these wonderfully handsome artists, but that her daughter Pankajam should get an education. So that became, since she couldn't go to Shantiniketan, that became the central motive of her life, an education for her daughter. So that is step one, Then you have Pankajam, who again has a rather unfortunate marriage, and decides that her answer will be, but she's very different, unlike Subbulakshmi, who retreats, who withdraws, who becomes what Maithili calls a silenced text, or perhaps that's what you say. But Pankajam is outgoing, and she decides she's going to be the best mother there ever was. So whether it's reading, writing, whether it's making them have egg flips in this Tambram household, so she does everything possible. She writes wonderful letters to Maithili when she's in America, saying, what is it like when you drive across America? What was Cuba like? Because Maithili did a wonderfully clandestine visit to Cuba. So there is this. And then, of course, like a reward to these women, there is Maithili. And here I must add that it's very hard for me to talk about Maithili academically, because I was 25 years old when I arrived in Chennai. And here was this leader, this trade unionist and, women's leader, who sought me out, came home and said, come join our organization. And after that, it was a mentor and a beloved friend, a truly extraordinary woman. And then I must add that we also need a sequel from Kalpana to tell us what it was like to grow up with this amazing chain of women who are teaching their children to find their way. You know, I think that's what's important. Now, having said that about personal histories, do you want to take a turn? Because I want to talk about the larger circles.
So, Kalpana and I both went to JNU together in 1994. And I feel like I didn't know her at all until I finished reading this book this morning. And I am like moved beyond tears because I feel that there's half the world that we don't know. Half the world that is sitting at home and cooking and cleaning and caring for old people in the home, and their lives are as political and substantial as the half that pretends to know it all by being outside, whether woman, man, trans, whatever. So I feel that it is so interesting to see Kalpana's feminism shine through in her writing of this book, Kalpana, and to see it as not a raging against the dark, as an angry feminist fiction. And in my head, immediately when I was reading this, I had Mother Mary Comes to Me, which I had finished reading as soon as it was out, as a contrast, which is a very angry book. It's a lovely book, but a very angry book. So, you know, I was thinking about there are two kinds of feminisms that are around just between September and November in our country. One is a raging, stomping, kind of how dare the world do this to us kind of fiction and non-fiction that Arundhati Roy is known for. But I actually love the fact that this is the other kind of political feminism, which is very sort of light and light, and it kind of fills me up. That book made me want to kill my own mother. This book makes me want to keep her. And I would like to be both people. I would like to be someone who's not always angry. And sometimes you need the company of narrative writing that Kalpana gives me. Kalpana has allowed me to falter, allowed my mother to be herself. And I think that is such an important political statement for Kalpana to make in writing A Woman of No Consequence. And of course, it's an ironical title. And I wanted to pull out a few things. You know, she talks of the tyranny of love. And she talks about the fact that if her grandmother Pankajam, who's the hero of this book, if her marriage had actually worked, and if it wasn't marital rape, which it is, which she's described it as, which her grandmother herself describes it as. And I love the fact that her grandmother says, fine, this man that I've married has absolutely no interest in me and no interest in sex with me. So I will sell myself to him in sex in order to be able to arrange for my children's education. So it's an arrangement I'm making, and she's very conscious of that. And in doing that, she is able to emotionally distance herself from this man and negotiate something. Instead of saying, chuck this man, you asshole, you fucker, instead of doing that, she's saying, I am going to be more intelligent about this. And that kind of feminism, which has probably been around since we were cave people, is something that we don't recognize, don't talk about, and certainly don't write about. It requires a lot of counterintuitive ability. And that's a very big, magnanimous heart that I know Kalpana has. So I love the fact that Kalpana has written this like that. The tyranny of love, if the marriage had worked. And how she talks about how her grandmother sees herself as a subject of history. So she is not a woman of no consequence in the sense that she is not a housewife who's only sitting at home, although I'd use the word only within quotes. But she's someone who is at home and in the world while being at home. She forces her father, she makes a trade-off with her father, saying that, okay, if you're pulling me out of school, not allowing me to get my SSLC certificate, then I want science and knowledge to be made available for me. So her father buys her a book of knowledge, which is like a whole encyclopedic thing, in which she learns about everything, so that by the time her children and grandchildren are going to college, she can talk about chromosomes, she can talk about DNA. She's read Einstein, she's read about the theory of relativity, she's read Carl Sagan, she's read about cement and concrete mixing, she's read CA's books, she's read all the philosophers, she's read Islamic Sufi literature, she's read Tamil literature, she's read everything under the sun. She has people who she converses with, Russian philosophers and experts on Sangam literature. She can have conversations with anyone without ever having finished school. That is the beauty of the book. To my mind, I think it's extraordinary, and it should stand with all the subaltern histories that we have been reading through time, which tells us about what the world is like for the subalterns, for the half of humanity that we choose to ignore and consign to the home, where you're supposed to not be thinking. But this is a very thinking person in her home who is defying everything while carrying out all of those incumbent duties that she had to. So really, I think that's marvelous.
We should actually ask Kalpana about, I think it's important to enlarge the personal is always alluring. We're all interested in other people's lives. But you have the larger world, the issues that are being debated, which is how Maithili writes about Subbulakshmi, and that's how Kalpana writes about her grandmother. So, of course, obviously, as Revati said, to begin with, the age of marriage. It's very interesting for us to read, to revisit the Sharda Act. And really, the Sharda Act said that as long as the body, the female body, is old enough to take sex and to bear a child, then that's okay. So the word consent, just as now when I think of it, when I was a school child and even a young college-going girl, the phrase sexual harassment didn't exist. We didn't know what it was. We knew very well what it was, but we didn't have the name for it. So similarly, the idea of consent, which is still such a vexed thing, so that's there as age of marriage, which is how you have this progress, important milestones. And remember, this is middle class and upper caste. So 13, Subbulakshmi gets married. Pankajam gets married at 17. 17. Maithili gets married at 32, and Kalpana we will not ask. But so you have this about age of marriage, that's one. Then the debate that was going on about the education of women. There was a debate. There were male intellectuals and public figures talking about women's education, but in the context of the Hindu reform context, also the freedom struggle. So it was very important to say that, yes, these women should be intelligent companions to the men, and they should bring up the children so that they are good citizens. So this is not only the imagination of what India should be like, what the new nation should be like, but also the consolidation of the new nation. So we're going to have, this sort of, so that's what, so basically that boiled down to they should be able to do accounts, they should be literate, but it's very interesting, English was banned. So with a lot of women, not just in Tamil Nadu but elsewhere, when they're trying to go beyond what they're allowed to read and write and know, because finally it's all about knowledge, English is not allowed. It's as if, and Pankajam, of course, does wonderfully because she ends up learning, I think, like 4 languages or something. So that's another debate. Then, of course, even larger, beyond India, you have, I think I must add here that Maithili was struck by the fact that Subbalakshmi told her, other than saying to Pankajam that maybe you should marry Haldar because he's so handsome, says, why don't you marry a Muslim? She said to Maithili out of the blue. And Maithili was highly amused, because we were, as children, we would be told, you're living in Bombay, please don't marry a Punjabi. The Punjabi was the other. I don't think the Muslim even got into the picture. But Maithili, ever honest, says, would she have said, marry somebody from a lower caste? So, you have these larger spaces and the questions there. And finally, I must add that there were global questions, which of course come much more sharply into the picture with Maithili, with the anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement. So really, this is a family archive, both this as well as A Woman of No Consequence and Haunted by Fire, which begins in the early years of the 20th century, but which continues now, because Maithili asks the question we are still struggling with, which is how do you enlarge these circles so that the various movements, which should be natural allies, the caste movement, the women's movement, the working class movements, how do they come together? That was the sum total of Maithili's life. And I'd like to think, when you see the two images of Subbalakshmi in her final years, dreaming every night that she sees a woman indentured laborer stretching out her hand in South Africa and saying, help me. A poignant, frustrated image of somebody who wants to go out into the world and act, not just know. And then her granddaughter actually makes that real. And here is the chronicler who tells us all about it for our present.
Kalpana, I wanted to ask you if you can take us through the emotional landscape as you were writing A Woman of No Consequence, because it is so rare to find this kind of feminist writing, which is powerful and quiet. It is not angry. It elevates you because it fills you up. It gives you, even if the woman in question is confined to her home, she unconfines herself. And how were you not angry? What is this kind of feminism? Were you consciously, did it just happen subconsciously because that's who you are? Or was there a conscious weaving of that kind of feminism in the narrative, in the way you wrote
And
it?
tell us about the men.
So first of all, I want to thank the two of you for your incredibly moving comments about the book. And I just wish it is being recorded. Okay, good. So, that's a tough question to answer, but I think something that happened in my life sometime between, say, maybe 2007, 2008 and 2021, that profoundly shaped the way I was in the world as just a human person in the world, was that I became a caregiver to my mother, Maithili. Maithili's, the last 15 years of Maithili's life were a slow descent into various stages of Alzheimer's dementia. And therefore, for me, it was about finding a way of being everything I wanted to be in the world as a teacher, as an active person. I'm active with many different campaigns in Tamil Nadu. And at the same time, to be able to say the most important thing I'm doing in my life is to be present for my mother, to never look away from my mother, to look at her, to see her for who she is becoming, for the transformation that she is undergoing. And while I can't help her in any, I can't reverse it, to witness it, to bear witness to her life, right? To never run from her, because sometimes I would also feel the urge to run because of the sheer terror of sometimes of what I was seeing. And I think that made me a quieter person. I think I sort of had a long period, protracted period, over which I grew up seeing this fiery woman. I grew up seeing almost everybody I knew around me look at my mother with awe and respect, including my own father. All his life, he would say to this day, he spent looking at his wife like this, in wonder and awe. And then I found that crumble as well. And I think I learned how it all ends, right? Where does the story end, right? And when you see that, when that becomes the real, in a way that I think it takes anger out of the body. I couldn't hold anger like that at anything, at any other injustice as well, in the body like that. Because then the anger I should have felt should have been I should have raged at what was happening to Maithili. But if I'd raged at it, I could not have been the carer for her that I became. Right? So I think that transformation, and it certainly transformed me as a person as well, also flows into this book in many ways. And now that you have asked this question makes me think about it, right? So I'm connecting the dots inside my head in the light of what you said. It's not a planted question. I didn't know what she was going to ask me, just to clarify that. But I certainly think that's perhaps how I was able to write in a certain way. But emotionally, I must also confess that writing about my grandfather and the way he was as a man and a husband was emotionally not easy for me to do. While I lost him when I was about 6 years old, I loved him quite deeply. I was quite his favorite grandchild, as I'd like to think. And it was hard to feel that I was not betraying him, right? In this, again, my mentor was also my mother, and she writes it in her preface. She says that she adored her grandfather, who adored her right back, but her grandmother, Subbalakshmi, was not easy to love. Right? Some people are not easy to love. Subbalakshmi was not a person that was easy to love. And yet, Maithili says, it is this grandfather who happened to play the role of an authoritarian husband in the life of the protagonist of my book, Subbalakshmi. Right? So I think that helped me. But there were passages where what I was doing is, since I had her longhand writing and I was typing everything out, I got some help with the typing, but some of it I didn't want to give out because I didn't want anybody else to read it first. I wanted to be the first to read it. So I was doing the typing, and I remember also physically falling ill during that period, and then slowly recognizing that I'm also reacting to what I'm doing now, right? So I'm reading Pankajam's some dimensions of my grandfather's life and their marriage, talking about the men now, that I was already privy to growing up. Because when I was quite young, Pankajam had told me all about her marriage in a manner in which I wish she had not when I was that young. I wish she had held on until I was a few years older. But she told me when I was about 13 or maybe even 12 or 14. And for me then, since I knew it, and I was reading her autofiction, I remember before I came to that part, I was thinking, should I write this into the story? And when I read her autofiction, I realized I had to write it because she had written it first. Because it was in Kamala's story, it was in Meena's story, it was in Lakshmi's story. And it was so raw in their stories that I could not duck the question, right? The other interesting thing about the men in this book is that they are imperfect men. They're like all humans are, I suppose. And they are...
Especially men.
They are quite terrible husbands. And they are loving fathers. And they redeem themselves by being the kind of fathers that they turned out to be. So Sivaraman, Maithili's father, so Maithili Sivaraman is her father, was the villain in her mother's life, but was not the villain in Maithili's life. So he was not an autocrat or a patriarch when it came to the choices his daughter made for herself. And I think that's very interesting. And he turned to his daughters for tenderness, for companionship, which they lovingly offered, right? And to say more would be to reveal the plot of the story about the men. The men are interesting. While The title might suggest the book is really women's stories, women's life histories. That's how it should be marketed also. I think the men are very interesting.
Have a small Pankajam.
Very interesting characters in this book. They're also fairly key characters. If it's a story about mothers and daughters, it's as much a story about fathers and daughters, or mothers and sons. Or how does this woman reimagine and rework motherhood? So, yes.
I just a couple of lines to be a little more light-hearted and not be so serious. Because Maithili had a wonderful sense of humor, and I learned that Pankajam, who's the woman of the evening, also had a sharp and dry sense of humor, because after my first novel, The Thousand Faces of Night, came out, and Maithili said to me, I have to make sure that you and my mother don't speak after this. So I said, why? So first, apparently, she said, are you sure she's your friend? So Maithili said, yes, of course she is, I'm telling you. And she said, but all your friends are so serious and boring. So you actually have a friend who wrote this novel. And then the second thing which worried Maithili was I had a chapter where I have old women protesting in all kinds of extraordinary ways in a Brahmin village, a village I happened, unfortunately, to know rather well. And so it seems Pankajam said to Maithili, she should have come and spoken to me. I would have given her what in Tamil, roughly translated, would be much more mirch masala about old women in a Brahmin village. So I do want to remember that, you know, we have to, when we think of what do we do with all this and women's histories, not that I'm equipped to talk about it academically, but I think perhaps we need to even enlarge the notion of not just histories, but resistance. So it's not given to everybody to march to parliament. So what are the various forms of resistance, not just across genders, but communities, castes, location? I think that might be a good thought to conclude with.
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. Thank you very much.
Thank you.